Good morning. We're still at Psalm 3, okay? There's a lot of intrigue and drama going on. And there's no way you're going to get fully into it unless you get the big picture, okay? You need to understand what God is doing, what David is doing, what the different generals are doing under David. You need to understand a kind of a character history, or you're not going to get the Psalms at all, okay? What I'm going to do is give you kind of the big picture of what's happening here with David. And you need to understand something as we get into this. There is all kind of a drama here and intrigue, murder, rape, conspiracies, espionage, everything imaginable. You know, also through all this, you see the sovereign hand of God. A lot of people are going to be killed. We're not talking a few, we're talking thousands of people are going to be killed because of certain men's choices. Okay, what we need to understand is if you go back into the Old Testament and you want to get a historical narrative of what is happening with Israel. First of all, Israel became a nation because God made a covenant with Abraham for offering up his son Isaac out of faith. Okay? He later reconfirmed that covenant under what's called the Davidic covenant, where he's going to promise David land, a reign, and a Messiah from his lineage. Okay? These covenants are unconditional. In other words, you don't have to do anything to see the fulfillment of this. And it's reasonably so, because they're going to do a lot of bad things, even David. Okay, so what happened, if you go back into 1 Samuel, they were under what's called a theocracy, Israel. That is, God was their king. They were not satisfied with that. They wanted to have a human king like all the other nations, so they kept asking God for a king. God told them, no, if you get a king, you're going to suffer because of that. Any power given to any leader, and this goes today too, that power will absolutely corrupt given any length of time. God knew that back then, and what was true back then is still true today. This not only applies for government leaders, this also applies to business owners, pastors, teachers, me, anybody that has any kind of authority over anybody. That authority is apt to corrupt given the right circumstances and occasion, as we see all through the Bible. Okay. So God warned them, I don't want you to have a king. I want to be your king. That's called a theocracy, but they didn't want that. They wanted a monarchy, a human king. So God gives them Saul. We know the story. Saul was a man after man's heart. And he did a lot of wicked, evil things. And God finally decided to seek out a man after his heart. And he found David, a little shepherd boy. Okay? So by the time David kills Goliath, Saul's becoming jealous of David, and he's trying to kill him for a number of years. Saul's son Jonathan became his best friend with David. Eventually, Saul and his son Jonathan were killed. David then comes in to the kingship, but not completely. He's under the kingdom of David, but the house of Saul still has their own kingdom. Okay, so in the midst of all this, and they're having civil war between the house of David and the house of Saul, there's some intrigue that happens. David's men are out to war. David stays home. I shared the story in the last video, what David did with Bathsheba and what he did to Uriah. Now, what I didn't share is what happened with, let's see, what was his name? His name was Joab. Joab was the commanding general for David's army. He was David's nephew. When David couldn't get Uriah to go home and sleep with his wife so that he would think he's the one that made her pregnant, not David, David takes a message, seals it, and of all people gives it to Uriah to take to Joab. This message contained Uriah's death warrant. David is so shrewd, he sends the message by Uriah. Uriah has no knowledge what's inside this message, that he's carrying his own death warrant to Joab. Now, Joab doesn't know what's going on, why David would do this, but Joab was a very faithful, loyal general. So Joab did what David instructed, and Uriah was killed. As time went by, everybody found out what David did, including Joab. Joab, from that point on, is no longer wholeheartedly loyal to David. I mean, if I was in, what David did was a terrible thing. He not only took Bathsheba, but he put to death an innocent man by the hands of his loyal general who did it unknowingly. You just don't do that and expect to have continual loyalties. This sets the stage for what's going to happen in a lot of murders and a lot of strife and a lot of drama that's and intrigue that's going to happen in David's life. Okay, so time goes by, and I tell you the story that eventually Amon ends up raping his daughter, his half-sister Tamar. Absalom finds out. David does nothing to him. He doesn't discipline, probably because he's feeling guilty about his own sins. And so Absalom takes it upon himself, and Absalom kills Amnon. Then he runs off. Okay? Well, it was Joab who eventually brought Absalom back to Jerusalem. It's a long story, but he finally reconciles with his father. Meanwhile, Absalom is conspiring to overtake his father and become king. Behind the scenes is a guy named Amasa. Amasa is the leader of the house of Saul, and they're still in civil war. So Amasa decides that he's going to side with Absalom in overtaking the father. Okay, Joab knows about this. Okay, Joab wants to kill Absalom, although David had said to all his soldiers, "Don't harm my son, Absalom." Okay, and Absalom was known to be the most beautiful man in all of Israel. In fact, his hair was so big and they said luxurious, that when he was riding out through the forest, his hair literally got caught in some trees and he was left hanging there. Some men came and told Joab, and Joab said to the men, "Why didn't you kill him?" And they all said, "Well, because David said not to harm him." And Joab right away took 3 steers, went to where Absalom was hanging, and threw the spears into Absalom and killed him. Okay, you got to understand now, you go back to 1 Samuel, you have a change going from a theocracy to a monarchy. Okay, but the monarchy isn't consolidated yet, and it still isn't, not even under David's reign. That's not going to happen until Solomon comes on the scene. Okay, so what else is going on? David finds out what Joab does. Instead of celebrating the victory that he can go back home now with all his, concubine and wives and all that, he mourns for his son Absalom, so all the soldiers under David are grieved. There's no victory here. Joab goes and confronts David and said, "What is this thing you're doing? Don't you realize we just had a big victory? You don't go out there and praise your men. You're going to lose everything." So David listens to Joab and goes out there. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, David conspires to put Amasa as general in place of Joab. Okay. Joab finds out and he kills him. He not only kills him, he kills Abner, who was another general who had earlier killed Asahel, his brother. Okay, Asahel was chasing him, and Abner told him to quit chasing me or I'm going to kill you. And Asahel wouldn't relinquish from chasing him. So Abner put his spear right through him and killed him dead. Okay, because of that, Joab had revenge, and so he killed 2 type generals. Okay, now David is running from Absalom. Okay, and that's what we pick up in Psalm 3. But you need to understand a couple of things. One, in a lot of ways, when you do character studies, for instance, I can really identify with Joab. Had my commander told me to literally betray one of my soldiers, I would have never trusted him again either. Okay? Never. Joab was a mighty warrior, and he was loyal to David all the way until the end. And that's where David had raised suspicion in him because of what his evil deed did. Okay, so when you read through the Old Testament, you got to put yourself in the shoes of everybody. Put yourself in the shoes of Uriah, the Hittite, who was the husband of Bathsheba. He didn't do anything wrong. In fact, he was loyal. And he died a terrible death that shouldn't have happened. Put yourself in the shoes of Bathsheba. She goes and now marries David. She loses her first son, marries David, and then gives him another son, Solomon, who is going to become the king after David, and through his line is going to come the Messiah. Can you believe that? Talk about the grace of God. Now, I read through all these different things, and I sit back, you know, and on my desk here, and I did because I got charts, massive charts, that I can chart out the whole history of everything, and I can see it all at a glance. And I get to thinking about all the people and all the different things that are going on and behind the scenes and everything. And you got to wonder, God, what in the world are you doing? You know, one thing that I come away with this is that you give somebody a little leeway in their heart, and there is no telling what evil they may do. Okay? The only reason Israel is blessed is not because of any good thing they did. Okay? It's because of God's sovereign choice. The same thing with you and me. What God chooses to give us in our life or take away from our lives is his choice. It has nothing to do, for the most part, with us. Okay? God has a plan, and he has a purpose. Now, that doesn't mean that everything is predetermined. No, because God still gives us free will in that plan. Okay? But I look at Joab, and I really identify with Joab. I identify with Uriah. I'm ticked off at David for what he did. Okay? My respect of him has really been lowered. Okay? There are others in the Bible that are the opposites. Everybody's different in terms of what they value in a person and what they don't. But now we're in the Psalm 3. And David's crying for help from God after a problem that he really created himself. And now the people are after him. Okay? So I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to finish this in another part, because I'm going to now get into the Psalms. And And we're going to now hear David's prayer in Psalm 3. It's a morning prayer. It's a praise prayer. Okay? It tells us that David wrote this as he is running from Absalom. So now we know some of the background. And now I'm going to read this prayer from David. And then you tell me what you think. Okay? I'll do that later today. So meanwhile, you have a little time to get involved in this and think about the bigger scheme of things as God is developing his theocracy. I mean, not his theocracy, his monarchy under the reign of David, now going to be Solomon, and then that isn't going to last too long. And you'll see what happens, and eventually he's going to work into the church. Okay, I'm sitting here at my big desk because I got to put all these papers here to keep everything in play. By the way, one more thing. Joab, at the end, was killed by Benaiah, who was Solomon's hitman. Yeah, the mafia hitman? Okay, well, Joab was David's hitman. And now Joab is going to be killed by Benaiah, Solomon's hitman, of all places, in a holy place, thinking that they may grant him a little mercy, and they didn't. They literally killed him, as he killed Abner and Amasa. In fact, when he killed Amasa, he literally grabbed him by the beard. He pretended like he dropped his sword, picked it up, grabbed Amasa by the beard, and up in his gut, and the Bible literally says his intestines spilled out. He's wallowing on the road, and people are coming by and they're looking at him. It's silent. And he's wallowing there, you know, and all his intestines and guts are spilling out until somebody had the decency to pick him up and drag him off the road and throw a tarp over him. You know, the Bible doesn't gloss over this stuff. So I'll talk to you more this evening. We'll go through that prayer